My brother sold our family home to my aunt without telling me.
The house had been in our family for 3 generations. It wasn't just wood and brick. It was the kind of place where every corner carried a memory. Every creak in the floor reminded you of a conversation that happened 20 years ago. My brother, Daniel, and I grew up there, fighting over the same bathroom, running through the halls during storms, pretending the attic was haunted. When our parents died within 2 years of each other, the house was all we had left that still felt like home. I thought that meant something to him, too. I was wrong. It started small, little things I should have noticed but didn't. Daniel stopped answering my calls as often. He'd say he was busy, that work was taking up more time. He handled most of the estate paperwork because he was the older one, more responsible. I trusted him completely. We were always close, or at least I thought we were. He'd promised that the house would stay in the family, that one day maybe we'd renovate it together, keep it as a summer place. I believed him because that's what brothers do. One Thursday evening, I drove back to the old house after a few months away. I'd been working out of town, saving up, planning to surprise Daniel with an idea for fixing up the porch that had started rotting last fall. But when I pulled into the driveway, I saw a for sale sign leaning against the mailbox. My first thought was that it had to be a mistake, maybe left over from some other property. Then I saw a woman's car parked in front of the house, an unfamiliar SUV with a county realtor sticker on the windshield. I knocked, and when no one answered, I used my old key. Inside, the smell was different. It didn't smell like home anymore. There were candles, boxes, paper scattered on the kitchen table, and sitting at that table was Aunt Margaret. She looked up at me with a mixture of guilt and irritation, like she'd been waiting for this moment. "You weren't supposed to see this yet," she said. I froze. "See what?" She sighed, setting down her pen. "The sale. It's already in process." "The sale?" I repeated, my voice cracking. "What sale?" She hesitated only a second. "The house. Daniel sold it to me last month." For a moment, I couldn't speak. I felt something collapse inside my chest, like the ground under me had given way. "That's impossible," I said finally. "He can't sell it without me. It's ours." Margaret looked at me with the kind of expression that only people who think they're smarter than you ever have. Half pity, half condescension. "Your parents left the property equally to both of you," she said calmly. "But Daniel handled the estate transfer. He had the authority to make the decision." "No," I said again, shaking my head. "No. He wouldn't do that." She smiled, thin and cold. "Then ask him." I did. I called him from the driveway, hands trembling, heart pounding in my throat. He picked up on the third ring, his voice too calm, too casual. "Hey, what's up?" "What's up?" I said, my voice rising. "Daniel, why the hell is Aunt Margaret in our house? Why is there a for sale sign out front?" There was a pause. A long one. Then he said, "I was going to tell you." "You sold it?" I said, disbelief turning to rage. "You sold our home." "It's not like that," he said quickly. "Look, I needed the money, okay? Things have been tight, and Aunt Margaret offered a fair price. She's keeping it in the family." "In the family?" I laughed bitterly. "You mean in her name? You sold it behind my back, Daniel, without even asking me." "I didn't think you'd agree." "That's the point," I shouted. "You don't get to make that call alone." He sighed like he was the one exhausted by my reaction. "It's done, okay? The paperwork's signed. It's legal." I couldn't breathe. The line went silent except for my pulse roaring in my ears. "You didn't even tell me," I whispered. "I'm sorry," he said. "It was the only way. You'll get your share. I'll make sure of that." I hung up before I said something I couldn't take back. That night, I slept in my car outside the house. I couldn't bring myself to leave. I watched as the lights went out one by one inside, knowing it wasn't my home anymore. Aunt Margaret had always been the kind of woman who smiled too wide, who pretended she cared when she was really calculating what she could gain. She was my mother's sister, but they hadn't spoken for years before Mom died. I'd always wondered why. Now I had my answer. In the morning, I went inside while she was out. The walls were stripped bare, photos gone, furniture rearranged. The echo of my parents' voices that had always lingered there was gone too. I stood in the middle of the living room where Dad used to fall asleep watching baseball, where Mom used to laugh so loud you could hear from the yard, and I realized something. They weren't coming back, and neither was the house. That was the moment I decided I wouldn't let it end like this. Daniel thought it was over. Margaret thought she'd won. They were both wrong. The next few days were a blur of anger and disbelief. I called Daniel again and again, but he stopped answering. He sent one text. "Please don't make this worse. It's just a house." Just a house. Those words burned through me every time I read them. To him, it might have been an address, a line on a document. But to me, it was everything. It was where our parents were buried in the garden they'd built by hand, where every photo album still smelled faintly of summer rain and old wood. Just a house, he said? He'd sold our history for a check he didn't even have the decency to show me. Aunt Margaret moved in quickly. Within a week, her car was parked in the driveway, curtains drawn, and the porch light, my mother's porch light, glowed cold white through the night. I started digging into the paperwork, contacting the county clerk's office, asking about the deed transfer. The woman at the desk said, "Looks like it was processed last month, full sale, signatures from both parties." "Both?" I asked. "Yes," she said. "Your brother and his co-owner, Margaret Foster." I froze. Margaret? Not me? "No," she said, checking again. "Daniel signed over his share to her with a joint ownership clause. She then bought the remainder outright." I didn't remember signing anything. Then it hit me. The last time I'd seen Daniel, months before, he'd handed me some estate paperwork. Just some updates for the insurance, he'd said, casual as ever. I'd signed it without reading because he was my brother. I trusted him. That trust had turned into my signature on the sale of my own home. I drove to his apartment that night. He lived on the edge of town in one of those bland new complexes that all look the same. When he opened the door, he looked surprised, but not guilty. Not enough, anyway. "We need to talk," I said, pushing past him. His place smelled like stale beer and stress. Piles of mail covered the counter, half of them marked "Final Notice." That told me more than he ever could. "You lied to me," I said. He rubbed his face, sighed. "I didn't lie, I just didn't tell you everything." "That's what lying is," I snapped. He sat down heavily, shoulders slumped. "I was drowning, okay? The medical bills after Dad, the taxes, the repairs. I tried to keep up, but I couldn't. I took out a loan using my share as collateral, and when I couldn't pay, Aunt Margaret stepped in. She offered to buy it outright, pay off my debts. It was either that or lose everything." "You didn't even ask me for help. You just handed it to her." He looked up at me, his eyes red-shot. "You were gone. You moved to another city. You didn't want the responsibility." "I didn't want to sell the only thing we had left." He flinched, but didn't argue. "I thought keeping it in the family was better than losing it to strangers." "She's not family," I said quietly. "Not anymore." He didn't answer. I left before I did something I'd regret. But as I was walking out, I noticed something. A stack of checks on his desk. Payments from Foster Holdings, LLC, Margaret's company. He hadn't just sold the house. He was still on her payroll. That night, I started planning. I wasn't sure what yet, but I knew I wasn't going to let them sit in that house and pretend they'd done nothing wrong. Margaret had always been greedy. She cheated my mother out of an inheritance years ago and pretended it was a misunderstanding. I used to think my parents were being paranoid when they said she'd never forgiven Mom for marrying Dad. Now I saw it clearly. This wasn't about money. It was about control. She'd always wanted to own what my mother had loved, and now she did. I drove by the house almost every night after that. I told myself it was to see what she was doing to it, but really it was because I couldn't let it go. Curtains drawn, new lights, the smell of fresh paint wafting through the cracked window frames. Every change was an insult. One night I saw her outside talking to Daniel. They were laughing, glasses of wine in hand, like this was all just business. He handed her an envelope. She patted his shoulder. I took a photo from my car. I didn't know what I'd do with it yet, but I kept it. A week later, I ran into our cousin Lisa at the grocery store. She leaned in and said quietly, "I heard Margaret's flipping the house. She's already got buyers lined up." My stomach dropped. "She's selling it again?" Lisa nodded. "She told people she got it cheap because her nephews didn't care about it." Didn't care? That night I went back to my apartment and opened my father's old lockbox. Inside were all his estate papers, original copies, including the will. I flipped through the pages until I found what I was looking for. Clause 14. The property known as 119 Elmwood shall remain in direct family ownership and shall not be sold outside of bloodline heirs without mutual consent. Mutual consent. Daniel had broken the will. Margaret had broken the law. I made copies of every page, printed the photo I'd taken of them laughing in the yard, and slid it all into a folder. For the first time in weeks, I slept without dreaming of walls collapsing, because now I knew exactly what I was going to do. They thought they'd outsmarted me. They hadn't met the version of me that had nothing left to lose.
The next morning, I went straight to a lawyer. He was an older man named Patterson. Gray suit, tired eyes, the kind of guy who'd seen enough family disputes to know where they always led. Nowhere good. I handed him the folder, told him everything from start to finish, leaving nothing out. He didn't interrupt, just kept tapping his pen against the table, eyes flicking over the documents. When I finished, he leaned back and sighed. "You've got something here," he said. "If that clause is legitimate and the signatures match, you might have grounds to challenge the sale." "Might?" I asked. "You mean I can get the house back?" He shook his head slowly. "Maybe, but it'll take time. And money. She's already filed ownership with the county, which means we'd have to prove fraud or breach of trust. If your brother knowingly falsified consent, that's fraud. But it's a civil matter, not criminal, unless you can show intent to deceive." I clenched my fists. He forged my signature. Isn't that intent enough? Patterson gave me that look lawyers give when they're trying to lower expectations without killing hope. "If you have proof, yes, but proving it won't be easy, especially if he claims you knew." I left his office angry but focused. Proof. That was what I needed. I started digging. I went through old emails, texts, anything that tied me to the estate before Daniel took over. I found one from him, dated months before the sale, asking me to sign insurance updates. It matched the date on the forged consent document. That was enough to show he'd misled me, but I needed more. I needed to connect Margaret, too, because if I went down this road, I wasn't just taking him to court, I was taking her. I started visiting the house again, but this time I didn't park in front. I watched from across the street, camera in hand. Over the next week, I caught workers going in and out, contractors, painters, landscapers. Margaret wasn't just flipping the house, she was gutting it, preparing to resell it for triple the price. Every photo I took was another nail in her coffin. I even caught Daniel there again, helping her move boxes. One night, I decided to get closer. I waited until after dark, when the lights were off and her car was gone. The side door still had the same lock Dad had installed decades ago, the same one I'd fixed when I was 16. I still remember how it stuck if you didn't jiggle the key just right. I slid a duplicate key into the lock and turned it slowly. The door opened with a sigh, like the house recognized me. Inside, everything was unrecognizable. The old oak table was gone, the family photos replaced by bland art. Even the walls were painted a sterile beige, erasing every trace of us. I walked through the house in silence, the floors creaking under my feet like they were whispering secrets. Upstairs, I found Daniel's handwriting on a stack of renovation notes. I took pictures. Then I opened Margaret's study, the one that used to be my mother's sewing room. On the desk was a folder labeled Elmwood Transaction. Inside were payment records, including a wire transfer from Foster Holdings, LLC, to Daniel's account for $60,000, 2 days before he signed the sale. Proof of a payoff. My pulse thundered as I photographed every page. That was it. That was what I needed. I left quietly, locking the door behind me. As I reached my car, headlights swept across the driveway. Margaret's SUV. I ducked behind a tree as she stepped out, humming, a glass of wine in one hand and a phone in the other. She went inside without noticing me. Through the window, I saw her pause in the living room, glance at one of the boxes, then pull out a framed photo, the one of me and Daniel as kids. She looked at it for a long time before setting it face down. That small gesture told me everything about how much she cared. I drove straight to Patterson's office the next morning and dropped the photos on his desk. He studied them, then looked up at me. "Well, if you're ready to go to war, this is a good start." War. That's what it was now. Not a family dispute, not a misunderstanding, a war. When Daniel finally called 2 days later, I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. "What do you want?" I said. He hesitated. "You've been to the house." "So what if I have?" "You broke in." "I used the key Dad gave me, the one you didn't bother to take away when you sold our lives out from under us." "Look," he said, his voice shaking slightly, "Margaret's upset. She says you've been following her, taking pictures. You need to stop this before it gets worse. It's already worse. You took something that wasn't yours, Daniel, and I have proof." He went silent. I could hear his breath on the line, shaky, uneven. "You don't understand," he said finally. She made me." "Made you what?" "She said if I didn't sell, she'd tell you something about Dad, something he didn't want you to know." The words froze me. "What the hell are you talking about?" But he hung up. I sat there staring at the phone, my heart pounding. A secret about Dad? Something worth selling a house over? Whatever it was, Margaret had used it like a weapon. And now I wasn't just fighting for property anymore. I was fighting for truth. I went back to the house that night, not to spy, not to take pictures, but because I needed answers. The lights were on upstairs, shadows moving through the windows. I parked down the street, waiting, watching. Margaret appeared in the doorway, phone pressed to her ear, pacing. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I saw her glance toward the attic window, the one that had always been locked. Then she went back inside. When she was gone, I walked up the steps, heart pounding, and looked through that same attic window from outside. There was a box, an old one, the same cedar chest my parents kept locked for years, the one Dad told us never to open. And suddenly, I knew exactly what Margaret was afraid of. Whatever was in that box wasn't just about the house. It was about him. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that box sitting in the attic, waiting, like a heartbeat under the floorboards. I kept replaying Daniel's words. She said she'd tell you something about Dad. What could she possibly know that would make him betray me? Our father had been a stubborn, proud man, but honest to his core. He wasn't the type to keep secrets, or so I thought. Still, the way Daniel said it, the fear in his voice, it wasn't about guilt. It was about something darker, something he'd been protecting. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I was going back into that attic. I didn't care if Margaret caught me. Whatever she was hiding, I needed to see it. I waited until noon, when I knew she'd be out. She had lunch every Thursday at the country club. She was predictable like that. I parked 2 streets over, cut through the back alley, and climbed the fence like I'd done 100 times as a kid, sneaking in past curfew. The house looked almost peaceful in the afternoon light, like it didn't know what kind of ugliness lived inside it now. The attic stairs groaned as I climbed, dust swirling in the sunlight. The cedar box sat right where I'd seen it, the same brass latch glinting faintly. I hesitated for a moment, almost expecting Dad's voice to stop me, but it didn't come. I opened it. Inside were papers, photos, old letters bound with a rubber band. At first it looked like random family junk, birth certificates, receipts, an old Bible. But then I saw it, a thin folder labeled Property Settlement 1989. I opened it and froze. It wasn't about the house. It was about ownership of land. The signature on the document wasn't just Dad's. It was Margaret's too. I scanned through the pages. It turned out my grandfather had owned multiple properties when he died. Most had gone to Dad, but one, a smaller, valuable plot by the lake, had been listed under both his and Margaret's names. According to the settlement, Margaret had sold her share years ago, but the sale had been contested. A note in my father's handwriting was clipped to it. She forged my signature. Never tell the kids. My stomach twisted. Margaret had done to him what Daniel had done to me, and now she'd done it again, this time with her son's help. I kept digging, hands shaking. Under the papers was a stack of letters addressed to my father from someone named E. Lang. The handwriting was shaky, old-fashioned. I read the first one, and my blood ran cold. It wasn't business. It was personal. The letter started,
You don't know me, but I believe I'm your daughter. Margaret told me everything. I read it twice, then a third time. The dates lined up, early 1990s. The writer mentioned living in another state, trying to contact him for years and being ignored. My father had another child, and the only person who knew was Margaret. I stood there in the dust and silence, the whole story unraveling in my head. Margaret had used it against him, blackmail, leverage, whatever you wanted to call it, and now she'd used the same secret to trap Daniel. I stuffed the papers and letters into my backpack. I was halfway down the stairs when I heard the sound of tires crunching gravel outside. I froze. Margaret was home early. I ducked into the hallway, pressing myself against the wall as her footsteps echoed through the house. "I know you're here," she called out, her voice sharp and calm. "You've been watching me for weeks. Did you really think I wouldn't notice?" I stayed silent. She walked into the living room, phone in hand. "You're just like your father," she said louder now, "always thinking you're the good one, but he wasn't, and neither are you." I edged toward the back door, moving quietly. My hand brushed against the old banister, the same one Dad had polished every year before Christmas. She must have heard it creak because her voice rose, hard and close. "He ruined my life, you know. He took everything that was supposed to be mine, and now I'm just taking it back." I didn't wait for more. I slipped out the side door, ran across the yard, and didn't stop until I reached my car. My hands were shaking so hard I dropped the keys twice before getting the engine started. Back at my apartment, I laid everything out on the table. The property papers, the forged signature, the letter about the daughter. It all made sense now. Margaret had forged documents before. My father must have found out, kept it quiet to protect the family name, and she'd used that secret against him. After he died, she used it against Daniel. The whole thing was a cycle of manipulation, and I was the last one standing in her way. That night, Daniel called again. His voice was low, panicked. "She knows you were there," he said. "I don't care," I said. "I found the letters." He went quiet. Then, almost whispering, "You weren't supposed to see those." "What's in them, Daniel?" I demanded. "Who is she?" He sighed long and heavy. "Dad didn't just have an affair. He had a child with her, a daughter. Margaret found out first. She's been using that ever since. When Dad refused to acknowledge it, she blackmailed him. That's why he left her out of the will." My mind spun. "And you helped her? After knowing all that?" "I didn't have a choice," he said. "She said she'd tell the press, ruin his name. And she said she'd prove he used company funds to cover it up." I laughed bitterly. "So you sold your soul for his ghost?" He didn't answer. Then, quietly, "You don't understand what she's capable of." "Oh, I understand. Better than you." I hung up, sat back, and stared at the pile of documents. For the first time, it wasn't anger driving me. It was clarity. Margaret had built her power through secrets, and now I had hers. I knew exactly how to take everything back.
For the first time in months, I wasn't reacting. I was planning. Everything she'd built rested on lies, and now I had proof of every single one. But I couldn't just run to the police or file a claim yet. Margaret had money, lawyers, connections. She could bury me in paperwork and drag it out for years. If I wanted to win, I had to be smart. I had to hit her where she couldn't defend herself, her reputation. I started by contacting people who used to work with my father. He'd run a small construction firm before he died, mostly local projects. One of his old partners, a man named Ellis, still lived nearby. When I showed him the forged property settlement, he whistled low and said, "I remember that mess. Your dad nearly lost everything because of her." He told me Margaret had tried to seize assets back then, claiming joint ownership, but Dad caught her and covered it up quietly to avoid scandal. He never forgave her, Ellis said. Said one day would come back around. Guess he was right. That gave me an idea. If I could prove a pattern of fraud, not just one act, it wouldn't be a family dispute anymore. It would be criminal. I spent nights combing through county records, property transfers, even old bank statements I found in Dad's boxes. Sure enough, her name appeared in at least 3 other questionable deals over the past 30 years. 2 involving relatives, 1 involving a charity trust she managed. Always the same method. Gain control, transfer quietly, sell under a shell company. But it wasn't enough to have facts. People needed to see it. So I started putting everything together: the documents, the timeline, the payments, the letter from my father, the proof of the payoff to Daniel. I wrote it all out like a case file, neat and organized. Then I started leaking pieces of it anonymously. First to a local journalist who covered estate corruption, then to a few people Margaret had wronged in the past. I didn't attach my name. I wanted her to feel it before she knew where it came from. It worked faster than I expected. Within a week, whispers started circulating. Someone at the country club leaked that an investigation was coming. Margaret's associates began distancing themselves quietly. Her company's lawyer resigned suddenly. Even Daniel called me in a panic. "What did you do?" he demanded. "I told the truth," I said. "She's furious," he said. "She says you're trying to destroy her." "I don't have to try," I said. "She did that herself." He swore under his breath. "You don't understand. She's talking about going after you legally, slander, defamation, whatever she can." "Let her," I said. "If she wants to go to court, she'll have to open the books, and that's where she dies." He didn't call again. A few days later, I got an envelope in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single piece of paper with 5 words written in neat cursive: "You don't know what you're doing." It wasn't signed, but I didn't need it to be. The handwriting was Margaret's. She was rattled, and that was good. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. She wasn't a type to sit and do nothing. If she felt cornered, she'd strike back, and she did. The next morning, I woke up to a knock on my door. It was 2 uniformed officers. "Mr. Dawson," one of them asked, "we have a warrant to search your residence." I stared at them, stunned. "For what?" They said for forgery and theft. I laughed in disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me." They weren't. They searched my apartment, took my laptop, my folders, even the copies of the documents I had made. It was a setup. She had flipped the story, claimed I had forged the original property papers to defame her. She had the money and influence to make it look credible. I spent 6 hours in a holding cell before Patterson bailed me out. He met me outside the station, shaking his head. "She's good," he said. "She's been doing this a long time, but don't panic, they don't have enough to charge you formally, not yet." "Not yet?" I said. "She's trying to bury me." "She's trying to scare you," he corrected. "That means she's afraid. You hit something real." I rubbed my eyes, exhausted. "I can't win this legally, can I?" "Maybe not in court, but in public you already are." He was right. The article went live the next morning. "Local businesswoman under investigation for decades of estate fraud." It didn't mention names, but anyone who knew her recognized the description. I watched from my car that afternoon as she stormed out of her office, reporters chasing her. For the first time, she looked small. Not powerful, not untouchable, just a tired woman clutching a purse full of lies. Daniel called again that night. His voice was shaking. "She's losing everything," he said. "Her accounts are frozen. Her partner's pulled out. What are you going to do?" "Finish it," I said. He was silent for a long time before whispering, "She's still family." I said, "So were we." And I hung up. 2 days later, I got another message from a number I didn't recognize. Just an address and a time. The house. Midnight. I knew it was her, and I knew I was walking into something dangerous. But after everything she'd taken, everything she'd done, there was no way I wasn't going.
The night air was cold, sharp enough to sting my lungs as I drove toward the house. The streets were empty, the town half asleep, only the faint hum of the engine keeping me company. I parked down the block, the same spot I'd watched from so many times before, and just sat there for a moment, staring at the faint glow in the attic window. She was waiting for me. I could feel it. My hands trembled slightly as I turned off the ignition. I wasn't afraid of her anymore. Not really. I was afraid of what this night might do to the last bit of restraint I had left. When I reached the porch, the door was already unlocked. Of course it was. She wanted me inside. I stepped into the living room, the same space where I'd grown up, now stripped of everything that had made it home. Margaret was standing near the fireplace, a glass of wine in her hand, her expression calm, too calm. "You took your time," she said. I wasn't sure if this was an invitation or a trap. "Both," she said with a faint smile. "Sit down." I didn't. You tried to have me arrested. I tried to remind you that you're playing a game you don't understand, she said, swirling the wine. You think truth wins in this world? It doesn't. Power does, and I've been surviving longer than you've been alive. By stealing from your own family, I said. Her smile tightened. Family, she repeated. You keep saying that word like it means something. Let me tell you a secret, dear. Your father said the same thing once, until I reminded him what loyalty really costs. Loyalty, I snapped. You blackmailed him. You ruined him. I gave him a choice, she said evenly. He made the wrong one, just like Daniel did, just like you're doing now. What do you mean? I asked. She set her glass down and looked at me like she was about to deliver a sermon. Do you know why Daniel helped me? Why your father never told you the truth? Because that little girl, his illegitimate daughter, she didn't die like he told everyone she did. She's alive, and she's here. I stared at her, confused, disbelieving. What are you talking about? She smiled again, slow, poisonous. Your father couldn't face what he'd done, so he let me handle it. I raised her as my own. You've met her. My stomach dropped. I stepped back, shaking my head. No, that's not possible. Her eyes glittered. Oh, but it is. The niece you always adored. Lisa. I froze. Lisa, our cousin. The one who'd warned me Margaret was flipping the house. The one who'd been on my side through all of this. You're lying, I said. Am I? She said softly. Ask her. Ask her who's been paying her tuition, her rent, her car. My mouth dried. You're trying to manipulate me again. I don't need to, she said. You've already done everything I wanted. You've destroyed Daniel, ruined my reputation, burned the family name to ashes. And for what? A pile of bricks? She took a step closer. You think you've won, but you haven't. You've only proven you're one of us. Not like you, I said. Exactly like me. You want revenge. That's what we do in this family. We take. You learn from the best. Something in me snapped. I stepped forward, voice low and steady. No, I learned what happens when you take too much. For a second, I thought she'd hit me. Instead, she laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. You think you can undo what's already done? The world already believes what it wants to believe. They always have. You can't fix a rotten tree by pruning its branches, boy. You have to burn the roots. She turned away, walking toward the window. You want to know why your father never left you the house outright? Because he didn't trust you to protect it. He knew what you'd become. I swallowed the words rising in my throat. He trusted me enough to keep his secret. Then you should have left it buried. Her voice had that edge again, dangerous, final. She reached into her coat pocket, and for one terrifying second, I thought she had a weapon. But instead, she pulled out a small envelope and tossed it on the floor between us. If you want to know the truth, take it, but be careful what you wish for. I waited until she walked past me and out the door, heels clicking on the hardwood. I stood there for a long time staring at that envelope. Finally, I picked it up. Inside was a single photograph. My father, younger, smiling, standing beside a woman I didn't recognize, holding a baby. On the back, in my father's handwriting, were 4 words. Keep her safe, Margaret. The world tilted. She'd been telling the truth. Lisa wasn't my cousin. She was my sister. I sat down hard on the floor, the photo shaking in my hand. The betrayal had layers I hadn't even begun to see. Margaret hadn't just stolen the house. She'd stolen a life, a story, an identity. And Daniel? Daniel had known. That was why he was so afraid. When I finally stood up, I wasn't angry anymore. I was cold, focused. Because now I understood what had to be done. Margaret had taken everything from this family, twisted every truth until it bent to her will. But she'd just given me the one thing she could never control. Proof that she'd built her empire on lies and the key to tearing it down completely. The house had been hers for months.
Now it was going to be her prison.
I drove that night, not to the papers, not to the reporter, not even to Patterson. I drove to Lisa. The streetlights blurred past like a film strip as I replayed with Photo over and over in my head. Keep her safe, Margaret. My hands were steady now, not shaking with fear, but with purpose. If what Margaret had done was true, if Dad had a child she'd hidden and raised as a niece, then this wasn't just property theft. It was identity theft, betrayal, a lifetime stolen. I needed Lisa to know what her history actually was, and I needed an ally who could feel the same outrage I did. I found her at a coffee shop 2 towns over, hair tucked under a knit cap, a stack of college books spread on the table. When she looked up and saw me, she smiled like always, warm and unsuspecting. I sat and watched her for a long second and remembered the summers when she used to bring pies over and we ate them on the back steps. She looked older now, guarded in ways I'd missed, but when I told her I needed to talk, she didn't resist. I showed her the photograph and the letter, watching her face go white, page by page. Her hands trembled as she read Dad's handwriting. "He wrote this?" she whispered. "He told me once he'd been unfair," she said slowly, "about a woman he loved before our time. He mentioned a child, but I thought he meant gossip. I never imagined." The rest of her voice broke into silence. She folded her hands and looked up at me like someone trying to piece together a life that had been rearranged without their permission. "Why would Margaret do this?" she asked. "Why hide me and call me her niece?" I told her everything I'd found. The forged settlement, the wire transfers, Daniel's payoff, the patterns in county records. As I spoke, rage and pity tangled together inside me. Lisa's eyes hardened. "She used you," she said quietly. "She used you both." Once she knew, there was no turning back. We made a list like soldiers planning a campaign. Witnesses, documents, timelines, the people Margaret had cheated years ago. Lisa remembered small things she'd dismissed as family eccentricities. A woman who suddenly paid for tuition one semester. A hand-signed check tucked into a birthday card that never came from the family purse. With her memories and the material from the attic, my case was no longer one man's anger, it was a history with living proof. We went back to Patterson that afternoon with Lisa in tow. He listened with a face that betrayed both sympathy and concern. "This changes everything," he said. "With a living claimant who has standing and with the pattern of fraud you've documented, we can escalate this beyond a he-said-she-said dispute. But be warned, once you open this door, there's no controlling what falls out." We spent the next week building a legal scaffolding. Affidavits from Ellis and other old partners, notarized copies of the attic papers, the wire trail to Daniel's account and Lisa's sworn statement about how Margaret had supported her and why she thought Margaret had kept certain things secret. I also dug up a long-forgotten newspaper clipping about a land dispute in '89 that mentioned Margaret's name. Small, but useful contextual fuel for a pattern. While the legal paper trail grew, so did the social one. I reached out quietly to people Margaret had wronged in the past, folks who'd retreated from public fights, but who still kept score. Their stories stitched into the narrative. Threats, sudden transfers, quiet buyouts, a history of squeezing family until they complied. People began to whisper. That whispering was dangerous to Margaret because her power lived in silence and in people's willingness to look away. We didn't go public right away. There was a strategy to this. Expose enough to make her flinch, but hold back the full blow until the court papers were ready and we had witnesses prepped. We set traps to flush her out. Lisa placed a call to a long-lost school friend under the guise of casual curiosity. That friend confirmed Margaret had secretly bankrolled Lisa's life in phases, always insisting the money was from family savings. A retired notary I tracked down remembered signing a strange deed in the late '80s with a trembling woman who insisted the signature be smoothed over. The paper had been altered later. Each confirmation made the knot in my chest loosen into something like control. But Margaret was cunning, and she sensed the tightening noose. 2 nights before we were set to file a consolidated civil action asserting fraud, conversion, and constructive trust, I got a text. "Stop this, or you'll lose more than a house." No sender ID, no phone number, just that thin, clinical threat. I didn't tell Lisa or Patterson at first. Instead, I changed my routine. Different routes to work, meeting Patterson at a new diner, leaving no trace of our plans on my laptop without encrypted backups. But Lisa refused to be cowed. "She stole my life," she said bluntly. "If she wants to threaten, let her.
I want my name cleared." Her courage matched the cold logic of the evidence, and together we moved forward. The morning we finally filed, Patterson's hands shook only slightly as he slid the thick packet across the clerk's desk. The filing listed all the counts we could justify: fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, conversion, undue influence, and an ancillary request for an immediate injunctive order to prevent Margaret from selling any assets while the case proceeded. I watched Margaret's name on the courthouse docket and felt something like triumph, but it was tempered by a real awareness. Legal victory would not put back the years she'd stolen, nor would it undo the quiet betrayals at family tables. Still, it was a start. Outside the building, Lisa squeezed my hand tight and said, "Do you think Dad would have wanted us to fight like this?" I looked at the courthouse steps and the people flowing in and out, and realized what I'd always known deep down. Dad would have wanted truth, messy and painful though it might be. So we walked in.
The court filing hit harder than either of us expected. Within 48 hours, the town seemed to buzz with the kind of gossip that makes small communities eat themselves alive. Margaret had spent decades building her reputation: donations, charity luncheons, smiling photos with officials, and now the same people who used to praise her were whispering that she might be a fraud. The local paper ran a story titled "Prominent Businesswoman Accused of Decades of Deception." They didn't name me or Lisa directly, but everyone could read between the lines. Patterson warned me to stay quiet and let the case breathe, but that was easier said than done. Every time I saw Margaret's name trending on social media, every time I caught her face on the news, I felt the same cold satisfaction spread through me. She'd lived off other people's silence. Now the whole world was speaking. The legal process, though, was slower and uglier than I'd imagined. Margaret's lawyers filed counterclaims within days, accusing me and Lisa of fabricating evidence, of defamation, of emotional blackmail. She denied everything, claimed the signatures were legitimate, said my father had given her permission for every transfer. They tried to paint me as a bitter nephew trying to ruin a woman who had graciously cared for the family estate. Patterson told me not to panic. He said, "They'll throw everything they can. That's what bullies do when they run out of leverage." Still, it stung to see those lies written in legal language, as if truth and fiction were equal under the right font. Lisa handled it differently. She wasn't angry. She was focused, sharper than I'd ever seen her. She spent hours cross-checking details, scanning old letters, calling people I hadn't thought to contact. Watching her, I realized she was more like Dad than I had ever been. Quietly relentless, grounded by principle. It made sense now, knowing who she really was. For all the years Margaret had lied to her, something of him had survived in her. Maybe that's why Margaret hated her deep down, because Lisa was proof that her manipulation couldn't change blood. Weeks passed. Depositions began. Daniel tried to avoid being subpoenaed, but Patterson had him cornered. When he finally showed up, he looked exhausted, thinner, like a man who hadn't slept in days. He refused to meet my eyes as the court clerk swore him in. When the questioning started, he stumbled through rehearsed answers, insisting he hadn't known the documents were fraudulent, that he thought I'd agreed to the sale. But Patterson was ready. He pulled out the photo of him handing Margaret the envelope in the yard. "You received this payment 2 days before the sale, correct?" Daniel's throat worked visibly. "It was a loan, maybe. A gift, I don't remember." Patterson pressed harder, layer by layer, until Daniel's defenses cracked. Finally, he whispered, "She told me it was the only way to protect Dad's name." That silence after his confession felt endless. The court reporter's pen scratched the air like a verdict. When we left the deposition, Daniel caught up to me in the parking lot. "You've ruined everything," he said quietly. "No," I told him. "She did. You just helped." He looked like he wanted to hit me, but he didn't. Instead, he said, "You think you've won? You have no idea what she's capable of." Then he walked away. The next day, Patterson called. "We might have a problem," he said. "Margaret's lawyers just filed a motion claiming new evidence, documents supposedly proving your father acknowledged the property transfer before his death." My heart sank. "She forged more?" "Most likely," he said. "But the timing is suspicious. Those papers never existed until now."
He paused. She's desperate, and desperate people do stupid things. Be careful. I didn't need the warning. That night, as I was leaving my apartment, I noticed my car door slightly open. Nothing was stolen, but my glove compartment had been searched. Someone had been inside. I checked my rearview mirror every few blocks after that, half expecting to see her SUV, but the street stayed empty, dark, indifferent. 2 days later, I got a call from Lisa. She came to my building, she said, voice trembling. Just stood outside, didn't say anything, just watched me. I told her to call the police, but she laughed bitterly. What will I tell them, that my aunt is staring too hard? It was the first time I felt fear, not anger. Margaret wasn't losing gracefully. She was unraveling, and when people like her lose control, they lash out. Patterson filed an emergency restraining order for both of us that next morning. It wouldn't stop her from scheming, but it gave us paper to wave in her face. Despite everything, a part of me almost pitied her. For all her money and power, she was still the same bitter woman who couldn't stand seeing someone else have what she thought she deserved. Every move she'd made came from fear, of insignificance, of being forgotten. But pity didn't erase what she'd done. The first hearing finally came at the end of that month. The courtroom was small, wood-paneled, the kind of place where echoes carried too well. Margaret sat across from us in a gray suit, her expression carefully composed, but her eyes gave her away. They darted, restless, scanning for allies who weren't there. Daniel sat behind her, looking smaller than I'd ever seen him. Lisa squeezed my hand once before the judge entered. Patterson started strong, laying out the timeline, the evidence, the financial transfers, the forged documents. When he held up the photograph of Dad's note, "Keep her safe, Margaret," the room went silent. Even the judge leaned forward. Then Margaret's lawyer stood, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, this is a family dispute twisted into litigation. My client acted out of love, not malice. These accusations are nothing but vindictive speculation." But when Margaret finally took the stand herself, something broke. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe pride, but the calm facade she'd worn her entire life began to crack. Patterson asked her why she'd hidden Lisa's identity. She smiled tightly and said, "Because some truths destroy families." "And forging documents doesn't?" he pressed. "Sometimes lies are kinder." That sentence hung in the air like smoke. When the hearing ended, no one spoke. The judge took the case under advisement, promising a written decision within weeks. Outside, reporters swarmed, cameras flashing. Margaret pushed past them wordlessly, Daniel trailing behind like a ghost. Lisa and I stood on the courthouse steps watching them go. She turned to me and said quietly, "Do you think she even believes what she's saying?" I thought about it for a long moment before answering. "Yes," I said. "That's what makes her dangerous." We didn't talk the rest of the drive home. But in the silence, I realized something. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It never really had been. It was about reclaiming the truth before it disappeared forever. And for the first time in years, I felt like my father could finally rest.
The weeks that followed the hearing felt endless. Every morning I woke up, half expecting a call from Patterson, my heart already bracing for whatever news came next. Lisa was the only one who stayed calm. She spent her time organizing the evidence binders, preparing for depositions that might never happen, as if the routine itself was the only thing keeping her grounded. I envied her composure. I wanted to believe this was nearly over, that justice was something we could hold in our hands, and not just an idea that people threw around to make suffering sound noble. But every day that passed without a verdict made me question everything again. Margaret went silent after the hearing. No statements to the press, no appearances at the country club, no new legal filings. It was eerie, that kind of quiet that feels like the air before a storm. Even Daniel disappeared. His phone was disconnected, his apartment emptied. Patterson said it was normal, people run when their worlds collapse. But I couldn't shake the feeling that she was planning something final. Then, one evening, Patterson called. He said, "We got the ruling." I said, "And?" He said, "She lost." At first, I didn't move. I just sat there, the words echoing in my head. She lost. Patterson continued, his voice steady but with a trace of relief. The judge found sufficient evidence of fraudulent conveyance and undue influence. The house reverts to the estate under your and Lisa's joint ownership. The court also referred the matter to the district attorney for review of possible criminal charges. I didn't hear the rest. I was already standing, pacing, my chest tight. After everything, the lies, the threats, the sleepless nights, it was over. Or at least, I thought it was. Lisa cried when I told her. She hugged me so tightly I almost forgot how much pain we'd been carrying. "It's really over?" she asked through tears. "For now," I said. The first thing we did was go to the house, not to gloat, not to celebrate, just to see it again. The drive there felt like a loop through time. The same cracked road, the same trees bending over the fences. When we pulled up, the for sale sign was gone, and the place looked tired, like it had been holding its breath this whole time. We walked through the front door together. The smell of fresh paint and dust still lingered, but underneath it was something older, familiar. The faint scent of cedar and coffee. The ghost of our parents' home. We didn't speak for a long time. We just moved from room to room, touching the walls, the windowsills, the doorknobs. Everything had changed, but somehow it hadn't. I ended up in the attic again, the same place where it all began. The box was still there, empty now, but the dust around it told the story. The chaos, the digging, the secrets that had waited too long to be found. Margaret came up behind me, quietly. She asked, "Do you think she ever loved us?" I turned, meeting her eyes. I think she loved power more than anyone, and she mistook control for love. She nodded, wiping her face. Then I guess that's what we have to unlearn. We stayed there until the sun went down, talking about things we hadn't dared to before, about Dad, about the years we had lost, about the kind of family we wanted to rebuild from what was left. For the first time, there was no anger between us, no tension, just a quiet understanding that everything painful we'd gone through had led us back here, to this fragile peace. But peace never lasts long when people like Margaret are involved. 2 days later, Patterson called again. His voice was different this time, careful, measured. He said, "You should sit down. Margaret's dead." The words didn't register at first. "What?" He said, "She was found early this morning, apparent overdose. Daniel reported it." I sank into the chair, gripping the edge of the table. I didn't know what to feel. Not relief, not guilt, just a strange emptiness. Patterson went on, explaining how the police had ruled it as a possible suicide, that she had left no note, only a box of documents addressed to her attorney. I didn't care about the legal side. I just kept seeing her face that night in the house, calm, proud, certain she was untouchable. And now she was gone. Lisa came over within the hour. She didn't say anything at first, just sat across from me, eyes red but dry. "Do you think she meant to? Or was it an accident?" "I don't know," I said quietly. "Maybe it doesn't matter anymore." But it did matter. Because even in death, she wasn't done. The following week, Patterson called us back to his office. He had a folder on his desk, sealed and stamped. He said, "This came from her lawyer, part of her estate." Inside were 2 letters, one addressed to me, one addressed to Lisa. Mine was short, written in that same sharp, slanted handwriting I had come to hate. "You won the house. Congratulations. But you'll never understand the cost. Your father was not the man you think he was. The truth is buried deeper than either of you ever dug. If you want it, look where it all began." There was no signature, just that sentence. Look where it all began. Lisa looked at me, her eyes wide. She asked, "What does that mean?" I didn't know, but as I stared at the paper, I thought about one place neither of us had checked, the land by the lake. The one from the 1989 property dispute. The one Dad and Margaret had fought over. The place she had stolen from him once. And suddenly I realized this wasn't over. Not yet.